So, as we go through this seventh day of Passover, the verses of Song of Songs are particularly relevant and particularly precious. They are always. We have hints of them every Friday evening when we say Lecha Dodi, come my beloved, inspired by the Song of Songs. And in Sephardic communities, the entire Song of Songs, all 8 chapters, is read every Friday night in anticipation of the mystical wedding between the Jewish people and God, between the exiled feminine presence of God, the Shekhinah, Shabbat being an opportunity for devout Jews to imagine that she is reunited with her estranged husband, the masculine presence. It's laden with mystery and majesty and mysticism. And so much of that, the mystics loved the Song of Songs. So much of that is based on these extraordinary 8 chapters that we will never know who actually wrote them. They were written, we think, somewhere between the 10th century before the Common Era and the 2nd century before the Common Era. So that's a pretty wide open space of time. Modern scholars date it to around the 3rd century before the Common Era. Always has been associated with Solomon because of its opening line, Shir, HaShirim, Asher Lishlomo, Song of Songs, that is for Solomon or of Solomon or by Solomon. So we're still working on even translating the opening line. And the issue of translation is going to be very important in just a moment. Just going to take a few minutes on Song of Songs today, and then my hope is to share a song written in this time, very much inspired, probably inadvertently, but by this notion of communing with the divine, what we call in mysticism a quest for unio mystica, to be one with the divine presence, if only for a fleeting moment. So as it is tradition to read Song of Songs on Passover, I'm going to share just a few verses. We did a close look at a number of the chapters the other day at Torah study. We didn't quite get to the end. We summarized at the end. So for today's reading, it's done without a blessing, as most of the Megillot are. It's elevated status, but not quite to the status of commandment. It's more custom than not. So we do it without a blessing. And it is in a special melody that is the same melody used for Ecclesiastes at Sukkot and for the Book of Ruth at Shavuot. So here are the final verses of chapter 8, verses 10 through 14. Ve'im delet hi natsur aleha luach arez ani choma v'shadai kamigdalot az hayiti ve'einav kemotzeet shalom Keren haya lishlomo bevalamon Natan et hakerem lanotrim Ish Yahweh v'firyo elef kasef Karmi sheli lefanai Ha'elef lecha shlomo Umatayim lenotrim et piryo Hayoshevet paganim Chaverim Makshivim lekolecha shmini Berach todi Udemelecha litzvi Oy leofer ha'ayalim Al hare vesamim And you heard perhaps there are a couple of mentions of the word shalom, shlomo. There is a sense of peace, of beauty, of olfactory satisfaction, of sensual satisfaction, but also tremendous longing in the Song of Songs. The lovers, whether they are human or human and divine, long for one another. They come together briefly and then are separated again and go through pangs of yearning and separation and isolation and doing everything they can, even sometimes at their own peril, to find one another again. So the themes of Song of Songs have tantalized us for centuries. There was even discussion for a brief while long ago as to whether Song of Songs was perhaps too scandalous to be included in the primary Hebrew Bible. But it won the day, and particularly because of its traditional association with Solomon, it was placed firmly into the Jewish canon, set at this springtime of the year. And where it has diverged over the millennia is in whether we should translate or interpret the song as being a magnificent expression of yearning and love between human beings, or as it was read by our traditional sages, as an allegory between the Jewish people and God. That over our long relationship with God, which really began officially as a nation with that parting of the Sea of Reeds and that accepting upon ourselves the yoke of the commandments, although anyone taking a close look at the end of today's section was reminded we didn't end today's section on such a high note. No sooner had the Israelites experienced these extraordinary miracles than they were without water, and their hearts turned away from God, and they railed against Moses, and almost within a breath, the closeness that had been achieved at the Sea of Reeds is torn asunder because the vagaries of life come along and difficulty abounds, and it's easy to forget who we are and to what we are tethered in times of hardship. Other people become closer to tradition and a sense of the sacred and the spiritual in times of hardship, but it is so understandable that so many turn away and feel an immediate disconnect. So our Torah reflects all of those emotions, as does Song of Songs, this yearning to be together with the divine spirit, which can feel so frustrating, imprisoned in our earthly sphere. And the Bible acknowledges that very much as well. So I have with me the allegorical rendering following Rashi's translation of the Song of Songs, and I'm just going to give you one example. A traditional reading of the last verse of Song of Songs is something to this effect. Hurry, my beloved, as a swift gazelle, a young stag, to the hills of spices. Really quite provocative language. But the allegorical translation and reading renders it thus. Flee, my beloved, with a capital B, so speaking to a divine presence. Flee from our common exile and be like a gazelle or a young hart in your swiftness to redeem and rest your presence among us on the fragrant Mount Moriah, the site of your temple. They almost don't sound like they're translating the same verse, but that is the license that we have taken over the centuries to give Song of Songs a more lofty, perhaps a more ethereal, more exalted experience, that what we're really yearning for in Song of Songs is for God's presence to come and rest upon us. But maybe those two things aren't that far apart, because in the yearning to have a sense of what God is, a dear friend of mine, Susan Edwards Martin, wrote a song in the last couple of months. She called it God Is. And in a confluence of events that I feel so blessed to have been a part of, Susan rang me on the phone and asked if I would help her to translate her offering into Hebrew. Now, I have never translated anything from English to Hebrew, certainly not poetry. And It was a magical experience. But it allowed me a brief foray into the world of what it takes to render a text in one language into another. And just that one verse at the end of Song of Songs and the vastly different ways that tradition has heard it are also just a glimpse into the endless array of possibilities there are and the enormous challenge of translating one piece in the original language in which it was intended into another language without violating its spirit. And we really worked on wrestling with particularly the notion of the word God. In Susan's original piece, which I'll sing through once, she just uses God all the way through, only God, to name the divine presence. But I offered to her that because Judaism has so many ways of rendering the name of God, that we shouldn't restrict ourselves to one name of God in our Hebrew translation. Perhaps we could enjoy some of the enormous buffet of options for God's names. So in our final version of the song, and it was a treat to work on this and to think about what choices we should offer to convey the divine presence, we actually have a little glossary at the end of our translation. We used 4 names for God in a short piece. We used Shekhinah, the indwelling feminine God presence, which means the one who is near, Shekhinah. We used Ein Sof, the infinite, mystical, Kabbalistic, ultimate creator God. Ein Sof means infinite or without end. We used Elohai, my God, with the word El, one of the most ancient names of any Near Eastern deity involved in that word, Elohai, my God. And we also used El Shaddai. You heard in that last verse, if you were paying closely, V'Shaddai Kamigdalot. Shaddai is an ancient feminine-leaning name of God. It quite literally means God of nourishment, or I'm actually probably glossing that a little bit. Shaddayim is an ancient word for breasts. There is an idea that the El Shaddai was like the mother god, the mother goddess, even, if you will. So we used El Shaddai, which doesn't appear too much after the very early books of the Torah, although it does reappear later. God says to Moses, I am the one who revealed myself to your ancestors as El Shaddai. But we don't keep that name in the later books of the Torah. So these were just 4 of the names that we wrestled with and enjoyed luxuriating in when we rendered Susan's beautiful piece, simple piece, deceptively simple, it's anything but, into Hebrew. So I thank her for the opportunity to walk in the shoes of the translators and know that it is no small thing to transfer words in one language to another. So with your permission and in the spirit of Song of Songs, I'm going to share with you my friend Susan Edwards Martin's piece, God Is, and then my Hebrew translation, which received loving edits, just a few of them, from my very first Hebrew teacher, Ruthie Rosenwald at Hebrew Academy. She and I had such fun after all these decades asking her and enjoying the fact that she corrected my homework with, I think, the same red pen that she had in those days as well. But what a beautiful rounding of the circle to work on a translation into Hebrew with Mrs. Rosenwald. So I want to thank her specially as well. Okay. Here we go. A song inspired by Song of Songs called God Is. God is love, God is peace, God's in everything I see. God's divine, God is mine, God's the very air I breathe. I give thanks שכינה היא אהבה בכל כיוון שאני רואה, קדושה שכינה היא הרוח בנשמה, מודה באמונה האהבה הזאת שלי, בשלום בכל מקום, אין סוף הוא בתוכי. אני יודעת שזה נכון, אמת עמוק בפנים, האהבה היא גם אני, אותה מקבלת פנים. שכינה היא שמחה, נדיבות בנשמתי, אלוהי אל שדי, אהבה שבליבי. God's the love that lives in me. God's the love, האהבה שגרה בליבי. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.